Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today, we're diving into a case that's had a short list of suspects from the very beginning, but still remains unsolved over a decade later. Today's episode is about the murder of Stacey Burns. May 10th, 2009 was Mother's Day. A Sunday that should be filled with breakfast in bed and love from her family would instead be filled with horror when Stacey's son, 15-year-old Michael, discovered his mother dead on the floor of her bedroom. She had been brutally murdered just hours earlier. It's reported in an article from the Green Valley News that she had been stabbed 27 times. Her wounds spread across her face, neck, and head. This was a savagely violent, passion-fueled crime. Who would do this to such a kind and loving person, a friend to everyone, a mother, and as her children lay dreaming just a short distance away? At the time of her death, Stacey was 41 years old. She lived in a big, beautiful colonial smack dab on Main Street in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone. She had such a warm personality. Those who knew her loved her, especially the kids at Carpenter Elementary, where she worked as their school nurse. But long before Stacey graced the halls of Carpenter Elementary, she met a man who she would eventually marry. In 1991, Stacey began dating Ed Burns, and the two quickly became infatuated with each other, marrying just a short time later in 92. Things started out passionately, as they often do, but the honeymoon phase wouldn't last. Over the next 10 years, the Burns would go on to have 5 children. Their oldest, Michael, was their only boy. Shannon and Kelly fell in the middle, with Morgan and Madison, the youngest of the 4 girls, being twins. Stacey and Ed obviously had their hands full, and unfortunately, due to Ed's job as a merchant marine, the brunt of the responsibilities landed on Stacey's shoulders.
I never thought about it before, but when I imagine a merchant marine, the first thing that pops into my head is like a guy sailing around on a little boat wearing a long trench coat, and when he docks, he's going up to people, flashing open his coat saying, "Want to buy a watch?"
I felt the same way. I mean, not quite the want to buy a watch bit, but I honestly didn't know any of the specifics. So to kind of explain what a merchant marine is, I went to usmm.org, which stated, quote, "The merchant marine is the fleet of ships which carries imports and exports during peacetime and becomes a naval auxiliary during wartime to deliver troops and war material," end quote. So now that we've explained that, we can see why Ed's job required him to leave home rather frequently and maybe even for long periods of time, leaving Stacey to tend to the house and kids while he was gone. I can't even imagine how one person could handle 5 kids by themselves. I feel like it'd be insanity with 2 parents, never mind just one, but Stacey made it work. It seems as though things were actually easier when Ed was away. You see, Ed was controlling, to say the least. Whenever he would come home from his long hauls out at sea, it seemed as though the arguments between he and his wife would just get worse and worse, and sadly, more petty. Ultimately, in 2007, the couple would separate and work through the divorce proceedings. It took some time, but by the end of 2008, the two were officially divorced. At this point, it's been a year or more since Stacey had separated from her husband, and one could assume that she was probably ready to start casually dating again. Stacey meets a man named Jim Vidum, a local guy whose son played hockey with her son. He was a logger, which is kind of like a glorified lumberjack. They hit it off right away, but it seemed like Stacey and Jim weren't really on the same wavelength. She had just gotten out of a long, controlling marriage. I think it's easy to understand that she wouldn't want to be diving headfirst into something new. She's just getting back into the dating scene. Jim, on the other hand, was head over heels and ready to make a commitment. This may have pushed Stacey away. After numerous attempts, she would finally end their romantic relationship just a short time before she was murdered. Sure, this leads most of us sleuths down the alleyway of accusation, thinking that Jim must be our guy. A man, madly in love, recently told by his sweetheart that things were over. It'd be easy to end there, but there's a lot more to go through. After Stacey's initial attempt to break things off with Jim, he would continue to try and insert himself into her life. We find out that he had visited her house while she was hosting a movie night for her kids. Most importantly, he left just hours prior to her death. The next morning is Sunday, May 10th, the day when Stacey is found by Michael, stabbed to death in her bedroom. I can only imagine how frantic everyone was at this scene. A young Michael finding his mother brutally murdered with a house full of siblings and friends. The police securing the scene, contacting the ME, all the while trying to figure out who could have committed such a heinous crime.
I already have my suspicions for who's responsible. What do you think?
In my mind, I think it's easy to narrow it down to either Jim or Ed. I really don't think this was a random attack.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. And for me, at this point at least, I'm leaning more towards Jim.
I'm not saying that I don't agree, but tell me, why do you think that?
I may be jumping the gun here, but we have this guy who was clearly way more into Stacey than she was into him. Seems like he kept trying to get back together with her, even though it didn't seem like she was interested. Then we learned that he was over her house just hours before she was killed. To me, these are major red flags.
Sure, but does Jim being attached to Stacey after she breaks up with him really make him a killer?
I mean, maybe, maybe not. But when you have a clingy guy continuously coming around when it doesn't seem like he's wanted, and then the person he's enamored with ends up dead a few hours after he was with them, pretty sus to me.
While I feel like you're making a totally compelling argument, I think we need to dig a little deeper into both Jim and Ed in order to deduce whether or not either were capable of committing this crime. Going forward, we'll dissect each of these potential suspects a bit more in depth. That way, you'll be able to formulate your own conclusion on who you believe to be responsible. Let's start with Ed. As we can surmise, it seemed as though he had a hot temper. He was away for extended periods of time, he would choose to fight over petty things when he came home, and worst of all, he was controlling. The Burns live-in nanny Brittany tells 2020 that, quote, he wanted to know what Stacey was doing at all times, and if she would tell him the truth, he still wouldn't believe that it was the truth, end quote. Brittany also goes on to describe that she could tell that the animosity was growing between the couple, and that Stacey was not happy in her marriage, and seemingly for good reason. Ed himself even tells 2020 about some of the things that he and Stacey would argue about. It appeared as though most things had to do with the kids and their different ways of parenting. For example, Ed hated when the kids would eat sugary cereals. But I mean, come on, they're kids. It's like a rite of passage. You fill up your bowl of cereal and go watch TV on the couch on Saturday mornings. Give me a break, buddy. Why is that such a big deal? Truly, pick your battles. If it makes the kids happy and gives you a break, and especially gives Stacey a break, it's worth it. Stacey's practically raising 5 kids by herself, so I see no issue with this, at least in my opinion.
Especially if he's away most of the time. I think you've got to be pretty high and mighty to start battling over little stuff like that, especially when you're not even around half the time.
Exactly. I just don't see why he cares all that much either. I think he's thinking more along the lines of how he feels about the situation, rather than thinking about how it can alleviate stress for Stacey. And marriage is a give and take, so for him to try and control and get angry about all this little stuff, it's just silly in my mind. Ed went on to divulge in an interview with 2020 that Stacey had a side of her life that he couldn't see and was unable to control. That there are people that she may have hung around with that he didn't want her or the kids around. I mean, I get that in one respect, but honestly, you aren't home, like ever. She can't just spend all her days at home tending to the kids. It's clear now that Stacey and Ed's marriage was not working out as they'd intended. When every little thing becomes an argument and there's no trust between partners, it's only a matter of time before things boil over. And like we mentioned earlier, the couple would be divorced by the end of 2008. We find out that on Friday, May 8th, 2 days before Stacey was murdered, she had to drop the kids off to Ed. It's not exactly clear how long the kids were staying with him, but we do know that they were at least with him that Friday night. Regardless of the specifics, the meetup happens and the kids leave with Ed. Friends and family tell interviewers that Stacey was worried about seeing her ex because things were about to get contentious. Apparently, sometime after their divorce, Ed broke the rules set forth by the court in regards to finances and was now being found in contempt. It's not exactly clear what he'd done, but he and Stacey would soon be in front of a judge because of it. And when was this hearing for this infraction, you ask? Yeah, It was on Monday, May 11th, the day after Stacey would be killed. Coincidence? Maybe. All that aside, the meeting with Ed went off without a hitch. No issues, just a normal transfer of kids from one parent to the other. And from what we can tell, this seems like the last face-to-face interaction the two had prior to Stacey's death. As much as Stacey and Ed's past doesn't look favorable to Ed when viewing it under a microscope, it certainly doesn't mean he's a murderer. The last time the two met, they were amicable. There was no record of an argument, no threats, nothing that should be cause for concern.
Yeah, from what you're saying, it doesn't seem like there were any red flags with Ed, at least leading up to Stacey's death. You'd imagine that if he was the one responsible for her murder, then he would have shown some type of hostility in the days leading up to it.
For sure, but to play devil's advocate, he could have been trying to plan this all out and thought, if things went smoothly with Stacey when she dropped the kids off with him, that this wouldn't set off alarm bells with anyone about his attitude. One could think that his thought process is that after she's found dead, authorities wouldn't come looking at him right away.
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. I'm just not totally on board with Ed being the one responsible at this point.
As I was researching, the main thing I wanted to know was, did Ed still have the ability to get into the house unnoticed in the middle of the night? Like, did he still have a key or something that might give him easy access to get inside while the family was asleep? As I cross-referenced my sources, the same piece of information kept coming up over and over. It didn't matter if Ed had a key or not. It seems like Stacey had the habit of leaving her doors unlocked. Now, I'm about to go on a tangent here. I am in no way blaming Stacey for what happened. Let that be clear. The only person to blame is the depraved soul that took her life. But my feelings on locking doors and windows will forever be the same, and I will preach to the choir till my last breath about how important this is. I know, I get it. We always hear stories about small-town USA and how they're like, oh, we don't need to lock our doors around here. It's safe. I mean, I literally work with a woman who tells me this all the time. Oh, our neighborhood's so safe. Our town is so safe. No, criminals will go to any lengths. Crime can happen anytime, anywhere. There's no schedule or map to it. Think about these whacked out serial killers that travel across the country and pick random victims. The least we can do to protect ourselves is lock the door. At least there's some type of barrier to try and keep these nut jobs out. Even with locked doors, you're never out of the woods when it comes to crazed psychopaths who may want to do you harm.
Yeah, I don't really understand it. It's just always been second nature to me to lock both my house and car. I always hear about people's cars being gone through and then, come to find out, they left it unlocked. Boggles my mind.
I'm totally in agreement. I was looking through threads and forums online and I stumbled across a few where a lot of people were talking about how, since consuming tons of true crime content, they've become so much more aware of their personal safety and the normal everyday precautions they now take. Like they were talking about how they used to only lock their doors before they went to bed and now lock them immediately after coming inside.
Yeah. If you wouldn't want somebody coming in your house while you're asleep, I'm sure you just as well don't want some random stranger coming in during the day either.
My point exactly. Not to keep harping on it, but criminals don't just act out at night. Plenty of these crooks are brazen and they'll take any opportunity they can. So, lock your doors, lock your windows, that's all. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
You know, I feel like I've heard this somewhere before.
Well, obviously we have a rapist in Lincoln Park. He's climbing in your windows, he's snatching your people up, trying to rape them, so y'all need to hide your kids, hide your wife, and hide your husband because they raping everybody out here.
Let's get back to Ed. As I'd mentioned, the last time he and Stacey were face to face, a short time before her death, there were no issues. Things seemed cordial. If one were trying to make a case that Ed was responsible for Stacey's death, they may be thinking what I'd mentioned before, that sure, things may have seemed fine during their last interaction, but perhaps it was all a facade to hide his true intentions. Now, of course, anyone can speculate. At this point, there's really only two people that are suspected of being involved. But theories placing Ed at the crime scene during the time of the attack are thwarted when new evidence is discovered. Ed has an alibi, and not just a verbal one corroborated by a friend, but one with video proof. From the evidence collected, it appears that Ed was attending a party in Boston the night of Stacey's murder, and a friend of Ed's was able to provide footage showing him in attendance. To me, that seems like a pretty solid alibi. Boston to Wolfboro is about a 2-hour drive. What do you think?
I mean, I don't think the video proof completely rules Ed out, unless he's documented as being there all night. Leaving a party at midnight can still get you to Stacey's by 2 a.m. I'm not saying that I believe Ed is responsible, at least yet. Just saying he can't be ruled out just for being at a party a couple hours away from the crime scene.
True, I'm on the same page you are. I also really wanted to find the video footage of this to maybe see a timestamp or something, but unfortunately I couldn't even find this recording while I was researching.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be nice to have seen, but doesn't really make all that much of a difference. What I'm hung up on is, why would Ed kill the mother of his children? We've heard about these family annihilators like Chris Watts. Generally, it doesn't stop there. If it was Ed, I would imagine it'd be some type of murder-suicide situation. I don't think he would want to live with the thought of having killed Stacey while then taking on the burden of caring for their children alone. But just my 2 cents.
I wasn't even thinking along those lines, but you're totally right. And we actually find out later that the family would end up having some financial troubles, so it doesn't seem like Ed's in it for life insurance money or anything. Overall, I'm not sure what I think about Ed, but at this point, knowing about his alibi, and especially knowing what we find out about Jim Vidum, I'm on the side that Ed didn't have anything to do with Stacey's murder. So with that, let's move on to Jim Vidum. And boy, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's walk things back a bit. After Stacey had dropped the kids off to Ed, she had a date that same night. And no, it wasn't with Jim.
I'm sure that didn't go over too well with him. I assume this was after she had broken things off?
Well, it was after Stacey had at least attempted to break up with him. It's unclear how soon after, but I think we can assume it's probably at least a couple weeks later. And according to some articles I found, Jim was not thrilled. It was stated that he'd been waiting at Stacey's house when she returned from her date, still accompanied by the new guy. Apparently, Jim wanted to confront her about it.
Yeah, that's not stalkerish or anything.
Right? I have a lot of opinions on this. Personally, I don't really see anything wrong with her dating. She's a grown woman. She'd made it known that she did not want to continue a romantic relationship with Jim, and that she was not willing to make that type of commitment at the time. It's not her fault that Jim didn't agree with her decision. They had no strings attaching them. When Jim confronted Stacey and her date, he had the audacity to say that she shouldn't be dating anyone else so soon after she'd broken up with him.
This guy sounds like a man-child. He's acting like a high schooler trapped in an adult's body.
Yeah, you think? Pretty sure I had high school boyfriends deal with breakups better than this dude. And not to go on a complete and total tangent here, but I mean, come on, buddy. Who do you think you are? You don't get to control what Stacey does, who she sees, or who she goes on dates with. She had just left a controlling marriage. No wonder she didn't want to continue things with Jim. He's acting just as controlling.
I'm sure it probably caused the opposite effect of what he wanted. It was probably his clinginess that ended up pushing Stacey away in the first place.
What happened during the argument isn't well documented, but we know that the three eventually parted ways without serious incident, outside of the verbal altercation. Stacey was probably fuming at this point. She had just recently told Jim that things were over, and now he's showing up to her house, most likely ruining any chances she had with this new guy she went out with. I think it's pretty clear that Jim didn't get the clue. He seemed obsessed with Stacey. He made mention that within 3 months of them dating, that, quote, they were in love. Talk about delusional. Stacey's friends had mentioned in an interview with ABC that Stacey considered Jim a, quote, friend with benefits. This was clearly a situation where a guy was a lot more into the girl than she was into him. So the morning after Jim confronted Stacey and her date, it's Saturday, May 9th, and both of them had taken the night to cool off after yesterday's blow-up. Stacey invites Jim back over in the afternoon to talk. It seems as though the plan was to officially break things off. That way, there would be no confusion as to where they stood romantically. It's not clear what was said during their conversation, but a verbal argument ensued, with the two eventually making their way out to the driveway, yelling at each other. After some time, though, it appears that the two hashed things out and ended on agreeable terms. Once Jim leaves, Stacey talks to some of her friends to fill them in on what happened. Later that night, Stacey's hosting a movie night for her kids and a few of their friends. At some point, Jim shows up.
This guy can't take a freaking hint, can he?
I know. From what I read about him, he kinda seems like a bum. He was divorced from his previous wife, but still lived in her freaking basement.
Oh God. Now the stalker tendencies make even more sense. Regardless of their conversation about breaking up, I can only imagine that he was not willing to let it go that easily.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Now, in reference to why Jim was there, some sources say he went over at Stacey's request, and others say he just showed up. Either way, he's there, and it doesn't seem like Stacey kicks him out. Outside of that fact being a little blurry, it's also tough to discern who was in the house when referencing the kids. Some sources make it seem like Jim's kids were there, which would explain why he was, but others don't make that assumption. I'd guess this information may have been redacted because they were minors at the time. At this point, it seems like the only things really tying Jim and Stacey together may be the friendships between their children. I can only speculate that perhaps this was the reason why Stacey allowed Jim to come over that same night, after officially breaking things off. But in terms of the investigation, this whole scenario stands out to me. The fact that they'd just broken things off and he's back at her house again. I keep coming to the conclusion that either Jim must have begged and pleaded with her, or perhaps he was more forceful, demanding that he wanted to stay. I mean, that's total speculation, but based on what we know, Stacey was done with the relationship and Jim wasn't.
I agree with you in one aspect. I imagine him being more of the begging type, like taking advantage of Stacey's kind nature.
If we're on the right track, then one could assume that with Stacey being as nice as she was, she felt bad and gave in to his request. However, this idea would be refuted by Jim, who says that Stacey was the person to invite him over that night. I mean, I don't believe this, and unfortunately, Jim is the only one still able to attest to it. I just can't imagine a scenario where Stacey would willingly invite Jim over the same night after she had just told him for what? At least the second time in a week that she didn't want to continue their relationship? Regardless of how he ended up coming over, he stayed until around 11 p.m. Stacey's children were able to corroborate this. The next morning is when Stacey is found by Michael, stabbed to death in her bedroom. Authorities believe that she had been killed between 2 and 4 a.m. As I mentioned early on, she'd been stabbed 27 times across her head, face, and neck. This led many to believe that the person responsible was known to Stacey, potentially intimately, due to the viciousness displayed. So the day Stacey is found, and while police are on scene collecting evidence, Jim shows up to the house. Shannon, Stacey's oldest daughter, and Jim's daughter played lacrosse together, and the two families were supposed to be attending their game that morning. And again, I have to ask, why did Stacey and Jim have so many plans together after breaking up? I just don't get it. Anyway, when Jim gets to the crime scene and discovers what's happened to Stacey, he actually says, and I quote, "You've definitely got to look at me. You've got to clear me, because I'm going to be his reasonable doubt. Eddie killed her," end quote. This guy is already pointing the finger at someone else.
I feel like he's trying to insert himself into the investigation to try and remove any suspicion aimed towards him.
Yes, this is like straight out of an episode of Criminal Minds. An unsub inserting himself practically into the spotlight from the start. There's no doubt in my mind that Jim's our guy. And Ed Burns feels the same way I do, because he says, quote, "When you point your finger at someone, there's 3 fingers pointing back at you," end quote. And honestly, as much as I think Ed Burns may not have been the best husband or that great of a guy overall, I gotta say I agree with this statement. These facts are what would lead investigators to interrogate both Ed and Jim. During Jim's interview with authorities, he provides an alibi for the night Stacey was killed, stating that after leaving her house, he spent the rest of the night in his ex-wife's basement. I gotta say, to me, this is not as solid as Ed's alibi, where he had video footage of him being at a party 2 hours away.
Even before hearing about his crappy alibi, I thought Jim was responsible. But the more and more I hear, it just continues to solidify my belief. I mean, this guy's divorced, still living in his ex-wife's basement? Talk about demoralizing.
As investigators delve deeper into the days and weeks prior to Stacey's death, they discover more information regarding Jim and Stacey's relationship. They eventually question Jim about the night we mentioned earlier, when he waited outside Stacey's house to confront her and her date. He says, quote, "I wanted to confront the two of them so I could ask her, 'What are you doing?' You could say I was stalking her, but I think I was being her friend," end quote. Okay, Jimbo, think whatever you like, but saying that you were stalking your ex-girlfriend, To call her out for dating someone else after she'd broken up with you is not a good look for you, pal. Especially when she's killed about a day later. He admitted he was stalking her. This is clearly not a well-adjusted adult. How did he even know she was going on the date in the first place? Sure, Wolfboro's a small town, but it ain't that small.
Yeah, this is not a sensible human being. He's clearly obsessed.
Right? I think he was likely pissed off that she ended things and he was watching her. And once he saw that she was with another man, he thought this was the perfect time to make a scene. He likely didn't even realize that this would push Stacey away even further.
Yeah, because he's clueless. Probably why he's dwelling in his ex-wife's basement. He was probably grasping onto anything he could in an attempt to remove himself from the sad life he was living.
I totally agree. I mean, come on, we know Jim had a job, so why didn't he go find his own apartment? I don't really understand what's going on here, other than he seems like he latches on to women and cannot let go, even when they end things time and time again.
Yeah, it seems like there's often two sides of the spectrum. Some people will accept the breakup and move on, and others become obsessed and can't let go. It's pretty obvious that Jim falls into the latter category.
And I feel like it's these obsessed people that we hear about on the news who end up being involved in domestic violence disputes, or sometimes worse.
Yeah, and in this case, worse.
Just wait. I've got even more for you. Listen to this. During the early stages of the investigation, it seems like Jim didn't do himself any favors. Probably due to the comments he made to police. You know, like how he stalked Stacey. It's reported that he was interviewed for 14 hours after she was killed. During this time, he was administered a polygraph test, which he failed.
Guilty!
I know. His failing of the polygraph test doesn't prove he's guilty, but couple that with all the other weird stuff he's been doing and saying, come on, he's not looking so innocent. But honestly, it's like Jim just can't help himself. He seems to love the spotlight. He's done multiple interviews since Stacey's murder, and in my opinion, each one digs him into a deeper hole. The two that I found to be most interesting was one done with 2020 and another with an author who showed interest in writing a book about Stacey's case. But hear this. I've been holding back what I believe to be one of the most incriminating pieces of evidence found against Jim. In an interview Jim had with that author I mentioned, who goes by the name Southard, there was an interesting passage which stated that Jim made the following claims. Quote, he warned police they might find his blood under Stacey's fingernails. He said Stacey, a school nurse, dug a splinter out of his hand just hours before she died. He also said a tree branch had left a big scratch across his face. End quote. Well, I'll be frickin' damned. Ain't that a coinkydink?
You have got to be freaking kidding me.
I'm not. And boy, do I have questions. First of all, this whole frickin' splinter story, it sounds like something a kid would make up.
So let me get this straight. We're to believe that a random tree branch falls, scratching Jim's face, leaving a splinter in his hand that he's unable to remove himself. Sure, let's say I buy it. My next question is, how many fingers is he alleging that Stacey used to remove it? She grabbing it like a claw? What, did she use tweezers to yank it out if it was so hard to remove? How the hell could anyone believe this nonsense?
Who friggin' knows? It frustrates me to no end. You're telling me that I should believe this cockamamie story of yours when it's much easier to deduce that your face is scratched, most likely from Stacey attempting to defend herself, leading to your blood being under her nails.
I'm speechless at this point. There are so many questions that I would love to ask this guy.
I know. And after hearing this nonsense, are we positive Jim didn't just leave Stacey's house after movie night, work out his alibi, and then come back? Sure, Stacey's kids confirmed that he left around 11 p.m., but that honestly doesn't mean all that much to me. It gives Jim plenty of time for him to have driven home, shown face to his ex-wife, and then head back to Stacey's to kill her. It's not like he has someone saying they spent the whole night with him, ensuring that he couldn't have done it. We know that Stacey usually left the doors unlocked. This would give Jim easy entry back into the house later that night. And honestly, even if Stacey were being cautious and had intended to lock the doors, for all we know, Jim could have let himself out. It was late. Stacey had a bunch of kids in the house to keep an eye on. He could have left the door unlocked purposefully. Outside of all this speculation, the one thing that still appears to be true is that the doors were left unlocked, allowing the intruder access without disturbing anyone in the home. When trying to narrow down who the killer is, we can't forget how vicious this attack was. Former FBI Special Agent Brad Garrett told ABC News that, quote, "When you have that many wounds, particularly in the face, in the throat, and the head, it's really overkill. This is somebody that's full of rage and anger. And it isn't a general rage or anger. It's personal. It's personal between the killer and the victim," end quote.
I think we can say that this guy knows what he's talking about. Stacey was killed during a brutal attack. I think a lot of times when we hear about people being stabbed to death, we gloss over how insane it is when they're struck so many times. Hear me out for a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now do that 20 more times.
That's crazy. It really puts things into perspective. You're right. People think, oh yeah, that's a lot of times, but when you even just sit here and count it out, it makes a much heavier impact. Now, let all that marinate while you listen to this next quote from Sergeant Scott Gilbert, who's a cold case detective with the New Hampshire State Police. In the Green Valley News article that I referenced earlier, which reported on Southard's interview, Gilbert states, quote, "Vidum has offered alibis for everything the department has thrown at him, even laying out a detailed scenario in which he contends Ed Burns could have driven from Boston, killed Stacey, and driven back," end quote. The article goes on to state that, quote, "Gilbert isn't buying it and says the department is in constant communication with Vidum by email. He also confirmed that Jim's blood was found under Stacey's fingernails," end quote. And lastly, what I believe to be the most damning statement of them all is, quote, "What's missing is the person doing it coming to terms with it," he said of the case. Asked if that was a reference to Vidum, Gilbert replied, "Yep, he's not that smart. It'll happen. It'll come," end quote. Is everyone else on the same page as me here at this point? Yeah? Okay, good.
All right, so hypothetically, if I were in Jim's position, I would be trying to say as little as possible. Answer the officer's questions, and that's it. When you start coming up with a story about how somebody else is guilty, like Ed said before, point one finger at somebody, 3 are being pointed back at you. It makes you look so much more suspicious than you would have been had you just answered the questions and given an alibi. And I mean, the detectives are who should be formulating the theories about what happened with the information given to them. When you act like an all-seeing eye that has an answer for everything, it's pretty obvious that you're making some of it up.
Oh, for sure. Jim even claimed that he had heard Ed in passing state, quote, "death before divorce." I mean, even if this is true, Jim is clearly throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks, in an attempt to remove suspicion from himself. I don't know about all of you listening, but we're obviously and unequivocally of the opinion that Jim Vidum is responsible for the murder of Stacey Burns. His motive was fueled by jealousy. He was obsessed with Stacey. And when it was made clear that she was no longer interested in pursuing a romantic relationship with him, he snapped.
I imagine him being the type to say, "If I can't have her, no one can."
100%. He didn't seem to have the same explosive temper as Ed Burns did, so he likely could have been more methodical in his plan, like when coming up with his alibi for his blood being under Stacey's fingernails. Methodical, maybe. Believable? Absolutely not. I'm of the opinion that the blood and scratch mark are almost assuredly from Stacey fighting back. But unfortunately, regardless of what we believe, there, for some reason, never appeared to be enough evidence for authorities to go forward with any charges. Not for Jim or Ed. Stacey was killed in 2009, and there wasn't a whole lot of progress in her case outside of the questioning of Ed and Jim. That is, until 2018, when Ed makes his way back into the headlines as media catches wind he's been arrested. But not for the murder of his ex-wife. Ed's temper had finally gotten him into a heap of trouble, and he was arrested for stabbing a man in the back. Whoa, 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 whoa. Stabbed? Have we been on the wrong path this whole time?
Maybe. But if we're looking for an MO, stabbing alone doesn't really link the two cases. Stacey was brutally murdered in her sleep. It doesn't seem like this was the case here.
You're exactly right. We learn that Ed is charged with assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, and thankfully, the man he stabbed survived. Apparently, there was an altercation taking place between the two men when Ed warned the other guy that he would stab him, which he eventually did. When asked about the incident, Ed stated, quote, "I was attacked. I was defending myself. It was a prick. It went in like an eighth. I just wanted to stop it. Look at the wound. He was released. This is ridiculous." End quote. Now, me personally, I'd say this is kind of downplaying the whole situation, as police said they found, quote, "large amounts of blood throughout the apartment where the assault occurred." But if you ask me, I still don't think Ed killed Stacey, even after this incident. Like you said, the way each of these attacks went down are totally different outside of the weapon used. I honestly believe that Ed just can't control his angry outbursts. And I'm sure all the drama that ensued in his life after his divorce and Stacey's death didn't make it any better. Like I'd said before, it appears that the family had some serious financial difficulties after Stacey was killed and would eventually lose their beloved home to foreclosure. But, of course, none of that is any sort of excuse for Ed to stab someone. Ed's assault charges don't further the investigation into Stacey's murder, and things remain stagnant until the following year, 2019. Police allude to the fact that the wheels are turning once again, and they're working towards a long overdue resolution. They're not willing to reveal what has fueled their renewed enthusiasm, but they do seem as though they're motivated by something that could finally solve this case. One thing most people close to this case say is that authorities have worked hard since the early days of the investigation. The Associate Attorney General Jeff Strelzin says, quote, "I can tell you that our office and state police have worked on this case for thousands and thousands of hours. There's a group of dedicated people on this case and remain dedicated to try and get justice for Stacey and her family." End quote. It seems to me like police have a pretty clear idea of who's responsible, but I just can't help but wonder what could possibly be holding them back from filing charges. I mean, geez, even Jim has said that he believes police think it was him. That same police sergeant I mentioned earlier, Scott Gilbert, has come out and said that there's only a, quote, "slim possibility that Ed Burns was the person who committed this crime." He goes on to say, quote, "I'm pretty comfortable with his story," and that, quote, "Burns proved he was 2 hours away in Boston that night and is logistically off the table," end quote. I mean, there you have it. It appears that police have only had two suspects this whole time, Ed and Jim. And if they're saying Ed is off the table, but they aren't officially saying Jim Vinham is their guy, I think it's up to everyone else to read between the lines.
I can only imagine that police are worried that their case isn't airtight, and if they brought charges forward and their suspect were to be acquitted, then that's just as bad, if not worse, than never charging them in the first place.
You're right. Under double jeopardy, they'd be free. I'm sure I'd be thinking the same way. Like, if I'm going to charge this person, after all these years, I want to know that a jury will convict them without a shred of doubt. It's unfortunate that even with all the information we have, the evidence against Jim, or any other potential suspect for that matter, is still only conjecture. Anyone can form a narrative to try and place blame on another, but when looking at the evidence provided to the public, I feel like all roads lead to one conclusion. Over 700 people attended Stacey's funeral. Her family, her friends, they all came to bid farewell to the one who was taken from them far too soon. In 2012, the Burns family held a march to the State House in Stacey's honor, where they proclaimed that they did not believe Ed was involved and made specific mention that Jim was not encouraged to attend. Stacey is survived by her 5 beautiful children, all of whom have been left heartbroken and without the loving mother they deserve. She was taken from them during some of the most pivotal times of their lives, and they need to see the monster who stole her be brought to justice. If you know anything at all about who killed Stacey Burns, please call the New Hampshire State Police tip line at 603-223-3856 or contact Wolfboro Police at 603-569-8173. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.